Hi guys, welcome back to another episode of Unfollowing Mum. I hope you are all well. I have a guest with me today, and I'm really looking forward to chatting to this guest. We've met online on my Instagram account, which is at unfollowing_mum, as so many of you know and are part of that community. And I feel like this is going to be a really powerful episode because not only are we talking about a personal perspective, but also my guest today is a psychotherapist. So I'm going to introduce to you Harriet Gleeson. Hi, how are you?
Hey, it's good to be here. Thank you for having me.
Oh, thank you so much for coming on. So, for listeners that don't know you, can you let people know who you are and what you're about?
I'm Harriet. It's really quite exciting actually to meet another Harriet. I don't often get to meet another Harriet. I'm a psychotherapist. So I work solely online with one-to-one group therapy, sisterhood circles, and I also offer groups as well around supporting people to increase self-esteem and intimacy. So I work predominantly in supporting people to feel good enough, and I really believe that our current relationships and experiences and struggles are really rooted in our early childhood experiences. So I really help people to work through those really early childhood traumas to be able to feel more confident and happier in themselves.
I think I couldn't agree with you more on that our past experiences absolutely shape our relationships now, how we feel about ourselves, who we are, really. We develop that, or we don't develop that sense of self more crucially when we are growing up, when we're stretching for autonomy in our teen years and our tween years. And I'm seeing it now with my own kids. As they're getting into that tween phase, there's really that pull to be more independent. And these are the things that when I reflect on them, I didn't get when I was growing up. So tell me a little bit about your experiences and what drew you to this type of work.
So I would say that the work that I do is really rooted in the experiences that I've had and my own personal experience growing up within a dysfunctional family. When I was younger, I would say that things were quite chaotic at times. My parents were drinking. Um, and there was all kinds of stuff that was happening at the time. I guess for me, I think one of the hardest things was being the family scapegoat. And I don't want to say that too simplicitly because I think there were times when me and my sister would compete to be the favorite, but ultimately they were always allies.
Mm.
And I think that when things happened within the family, it tended to get put on me. I would be the problem. I'd be the one that had done things wrong. Yeah, and I think that really kind of stayed with me. I think that there would be, I think there was lots of stuff that was going on with my parents that meant that they weren't available to meet my needs. And they would have huge responses to that. And I remember there being times when I'd spend a lot of time in my room being isolated, sometimes till the
Mm.
next day, and I wouldn't be allowed to have my tea or come back downstairs because they couldn't bear to look at me. And yeah, I just always remember thinking, like, how did I end up here again? Like, what is it that I did wrong? And I think for a long time, I really felt that. And I think that was kind of what built up to getting to the point where I now am estranged with them. And yeah, and I guess I was thinking about this earlier of like it's such a complex question, isn't it, when you ask somebody what's their estrangement story, if you like, because there
Mm.
is no just one event. I think as children, or for me, I'd spent 30 years within the family. I'd put up with a lot of abuse and a lot of neglect. I was willing to, well, I wasn't willing, that's probably the wrong word, but I tolerated it for so long. I kind of was used to it. I'd created a
Mm.
fantasy about who I wanted my parents to be and that version of them that I loved. But I think it's when there isn't any accountability for that behavior, it gets to a point when it's no longer possible to continue it. And there tends to be lots and lots of events that build up to that point over many decades, not just one event.
And I think that's one of the biggest misconceptions, especially when you hear parents online talking about their kind of version of, oh, well, I'm estranged from my child. It's always perhaps there's been this one event, or it's been, well, they haven't told me why. And yet it's a consistent, it's almost like death by a thousand paper cuts. It's a consistent thing throughout an entire lifetime. And it really resonated with me what you said. You said specifically, what did I do wrong and how have I got here again? And oh, that internalizing is so huge, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think in that process of healing, it's being able to step back into your power and recognize that actually that's the projection of their stuff. It was
Mm.
them, not you.
Yeah. And it's so difficult. I think that is, for me, that was one of the hardest things, was to be able to let go of the fact that this wasn't me. And what I've
Mm.
noticed is, especially as I've grown older, there's been a pattern in the relationships that I'd been drawn to where, again, I'd be left thinking, well, what have I done wrong? Because it was the same types of people that I'd be drawn to. And for the majority of people that I speak to, they've either had relationships with people who remind them very much of their parents, whether they were emotionally unavailable, whether they were abusive in another way, whatever that might have looked like, they were drawn to similar, because I think we often are, when home is dysfunctional, drawn to more dysfunction. That's what we know. That's what feels
Yep.
safe and secure. That's what love looks like, isn't it? But then you're
Mm.
left with this internal narrative of, well, what did I do wrong? What is wrong with me? I must be the problem, because it can't be everyone else. So it must be me. And it really sits and weighs down on how you view yourself and that feeling of never being good enough.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's what led me to the point of not having contact with my
Mm,
family of origin anymore was, I'd spent time in therapy looking at the dynamics within the relationship. And I think initially, actually, when the first kind of big scapegoat rupture happened, I'm not the first person in my family to be estranged. There's a long history of this happening. And my two older siblings were also estranged from my family. And when this particular event happened, I could see really clearly the same dynamic that had happened with my other siblings, that my mum wasn't taking responsibility for something and I was kind of being her shield and I was left
mm,
feeling that it was my fault again. Um, and, there was a period of time in that where we didn't speak. My mum wasn't going to take any accountability and I was quite firm in this of, well, I'm not just going to brush this under the carpet this time. And anyway, I kind of did. And I told myself I could go back into it after a few months, and I had this day and I was with them and I think I was lulled into this false sense of security because I thought, God, this has been a really nice day and I can do this differently this time. I've spoken with my therapist how I can change my role in the family. And then the next day, literally, I was criticized for something else and I was back in the scapegoat again. I'd been devalued, trying to earn their approval and,
mm,
apologize. And I thought, oh God, I just can't do this anymore. I
mm.
can't keep putting myself in that position. This isn't all me. And I acknowledged that there were things that I'd done in the relationships that weren't great, that I had to take ownership for. But I think when I did that, it only gave my power away. It only proved to them even more that I was the problem and I was the dysfunctional person because they weren't looking at their stuff. And that was
Yeah.
that was hard.
Yeah, completely. And it's interesting that you mention about how you're willing to take accountability for your stuff, and you can reflect on that and say, "Oh, yeah, there were things that perhaps I contributed to in this relationship, or perhaps weren't me at my best." And I've said this myself on the podcast. I do not like the version of me that comes
Mm.
out when I was in a relationship with my mum. I wasn't a person that I would like to be. I don't think I was always kind. I could be really reactive, and
Yeah.
that's not who I want to be. But there is this almost sense that we have to acknowledge that, because that's what we're asking of them. But it's so quickly flipped back on you when you are that scapegoat. It's so quickly, oh, well, there's the proof that you're the problem, and weaponized against you. And my goodness, is it's such a difficult place to stand firm in knowing that you can both be accountable and also hold your boundary and say, no, I'm accountable for this. That does not make me accountable for all of this.
No, no. And I think that was something that, I think if I'm honest, when that happened, I felt quite angry
Mm,
because, my mum had said something that wasn't true. And, I had a really close relationship with my sister, or I thought that I did. And it caused a huge rupture between us. She didn't speak to me for weeks, and I was really hurt and upset by that. Even though I tried to maintain a relationship with her, it was really difficult because I always felt my mum's influence in the relationship. It was never
mm,
quite the same. There was always something that was off. And I think the angry part of me wanted to prove that she was lying. I wanted the truth to be out there. And I think what kind of complicates my story is, being the scapegoat and feeling different. I also realized that there was another element to that, in that found out that the man that had raised me wasn't my biological father. And
Right.
it was something that I kind of unearthed in this process because,
Mm.
over the few years before that, I'd been given a name of a man who I was told was actually my biological father. And it was always denied. And it was quite challenging to find out the truth. And it was a question mark that had been hanging over me for some time. And I think when this conflict had happened, and my mum had already kind of abandoned me by, not engaging with me about it, I kind of felt like I didn't have anything to lose anymore. I wanted all of the truths to be out there at any cost.
And what did that look like for your experience when you did actually step forward and get that truth out there? I can imagine that in some ways was really cathartic, but a very difficult process to go through because that's such a big bomb to have dropped on you.
Mm.
And especially when you're going through this process, in some ways, perhaps quite liberating, and in other ways, really difficult.
Yeah, I think, to be honest, I think the only person I hurt in that process was myself.
Mm,
You know, back then when I was trying to have conversations about my paternity, there was a lot of gaslighting, a lot of minimizing, a lot of denial. I think part of that is because also my mum doesn't know who her biological father is.
mm,
And I think she tells herself that it's okay. So she can't see why it wasn't okay for me to not know. Yeah, so an estranged family member contacted me with the name of a man that she said was, in fact, my biological father. And in the past, when I've tried to have that conversation with my mum, she's denied it. She denied
mm,
even knowing him at first, and then it got to a point where she said that she just didn't know. And I think that was a way of avoiding accountability because she knew that I was pursuing the truth, and if it came out, you know, she could be a victim in it, if you like.
mm,
Um, and the last conversation that I had with her, she was making beans on toast and she didn't want to talk to me because she was busy. And even though we'd not spoken for 4 months previously, and so there was lots of kind of abuse and gaslighting and denial and all of that kind of stuff. And I decided to do a DNA test and on Ancestry, and it came back with a match of other family members. And I sat on that for some time
mm,
because, that had a real impact on me that, I found out all of this stuff. Um, and, in the end, I did make contact with my dad and my sister to tell them what I knew because they were the ones that potentially didn't know.
okay.
Um, but I've been told that my mum did know, and it was very intentional, the choices that she made. So me and my mother have never had a conversation about this. She's never reached out to me to talk about what I know, to apologize for it, to give any explanation. And I think that's the part for me that if there was accountability and there was responsibility taken of, look, I know I made some selfish choices and I didn't make the right ones, and I'm sorry I didn't tell you when I lied, but this is why I did it and I care about you, then that would be really different. But I
Mm,
think there's what I'm feeling is a complete absence of love. And actually, it was more about her preserving her self image and
mm,
protecting herself. And I can understand all of that. As a therapist, I understand why she did what she did with the information that I have. But I can't brush that under the carpet anymore.
no, no. And it's not our responsibility as the adult children to brush those things under the carpet. There will be things that all of us will do that will eventually, our kids will come to us and say, I didn't like that, or that's done
Mhm.
something here that I'm not happy with, or that's upset me in some way. And that's for us to sit with that and say to them, yeah, do you know, this for me was about protecting this, or this was for doing this. And I didn't see it from that perspective. And I'm really sorry that that's caused the
Mhm.
hurt. It wasn't the
Yeah.
intention, but it has been the impact, and that needs to be acknowledged. And I've never met anybody talking about estrangement whose story and situation wouldn't be very different if
Mhm.
there had been some accountability, some acknowledgement.
Yeah.
And that gaslighting that you mentioned, it really impacts you, and it impacts you in so many different ways, but so deeply because it makes you question everything,
Yeah.
absolutely everything about who you are, what you are capable of, whether
Mhm.
you can trust yourself.
Yeah. Because for years, I just had this niggling feeling that she was being dishonest.
Mm,
And it's like I knew, but without the information, how do you truly know? And I think you're right in that I also gaslit myself in that of questioning my own reality and who I was and what that meant. There tends to be two types of kind of toxic narcissistic mothers, if you like, in these situations where you might have the mothers that are kind of trying to hoover you back into a relationship.
Hmm.
And that can be quite challenging in itself. But for me, my mum was more of the ignoring type, where she didn't make any attempt to repair the relationship. And that was quite hurtful, the abandonment of that initially. But in some ways, I think it made it easier for me because I couldn't be in a relationship with somebody that didn't want to be in a relationship with me.
Mm.
And every time I might have missed her or wanted things to be different, I always remembered that.
Yeah. And that you are quite right in that there's different responses that we get from parents. Some are continually trying to overstep the boundary. They're continually demanding that you get in contact. They're reaching out. They're telling everyone how awful this is. And
Mm,
for others, it seems appallingly easy for them to step away from their children.
yeah.
And I guess when we think about it, they've never really stepped forward for their children. And
Mm,
that's kind of the symbolism that comes up for me when I think about mothers who do sort of come out with, you see comments all the time of, oh, well, my life's so much more peaceful now that I don't have to put up with that. Or, oh, well, I've started living and I've let it go. And you think, how? How have
mm,
you not wanted to fight for a relationship with your
yeah.
child? And yet sometimes that's the reality that we're faced with. And I know my situation was quite opposite in that
Yeah.
my mum, I guess in a way I say that, but now I'm reflecting on it, perhaps not. My mum wasn't particularly bothered about a relationship with me. I was awful. It was more about having a relationship with my son, not my children, but just one in particular. And I think that was her idea of a do-over.
Sure.
Um, but that was very much how she responded, in that she wanted to have that relationship and that
Mm,
she wanted to be able to maintain control of me
mm,
and the house. And when that had slipped, of him.
yeah.
And yet, on the complete flip side, that parent that just goes, right, well, I don't want to know because this is too much for me and I'm not able to be accountable. I'm not able to step forward. That's really difficult to navigate on the flip side. Did your dad and your sister, were they aware, and have you been able to maintain any kind of relationship with your sister?
No. I still don't know whether my dad knew or not.
Mm.
Because, I sent him an email, I sent him a text, I called him, and he didn't respond to any of them. And when I contacted him prior to taking the test, I asked him if he'd be willing to do one with me, and he was really quite angry about that. I think there's a lot of avoidance, really quite emotionally unavailable. Um, and again, gaslighting in response to that, it became about them being the victims of me causing them so much stress and making them unwell. And actually, I just wanted to know who I was. I just wanted to know the truth. Um, so no, unfortunately, I didn't have a response from him about it. And, again, things felt really strange with my sister. It felt too complicated. I really
Mm.
tried to maintain that relationship independent of my mum. And it just didn't feel like it was possible because she was in connection with her. And while she was in connection with her, it felt like she couldn't really be connected to me.
Mm. I think that's the case so often when you are the scapegoat, and the triangulation that goes on within this family of pushing you and pushing you and pushing you to the outside and always positioning you as the bad guy. As you say, you've come across this huge revelation that is massive for anyone and that anyone would want to explore, that we could all, as rational, responsible adults, say, oh, that makes sense that you'd want to explore that. And even if that is really confronting for me and really hard for me, I'm going to support you in that.
Yeah.
And I might feel very uncomfortable with it and say, well, I don't really want to talk too much about it. This is very difficult for me as well.
Mm,
However, I understand you wanting to stretch to find who this person is, to understand your history.
yeah.
All of that makes so much sense. And yet, when you are the scapegoat and you have that avoidance, it's become about, you're hurting me. You
Mm,
shouldn't be doing this. And it's like, well, that's such a perfectly normal reaction to
yeah.
have, to say, I want to know what my identity is, even down to things like your medical identity and all of that. That is all wrapped up in secrecy
Mm.
and in the unknown. And this person that you found out was your biological father, did you manage to get in contact with him at all?
He'd actually passed. He passed 10
Right.
years ago. So yeah, complete missed opportunity, and he didn't know about me.
Mm.
It's my understanding that she told him that I wasn't his. So yeah, there was I guess that's part of the grief.
Yeah. I can imagine that must be such a huge grief to realize that there is this missed opportunity, that you have this family of origin, if you like,
Mm,
who have misled you, and then you
mm,
haven't even been able to build this relationship with that person. And it feels very much to me like you have your mum at the center of all of this with puppet strings, and
mm.
everyone else is kind of being guided along.
Yeah, and it's really interesting that you say that as well, because this is something that I was thinking about earlier, actually, that, I remember that I was told that I'd made everything about me. And I just thought it was so interesting. It felt like such a big projection because actually my mum has complete control of everybody,
Mm.
family, you know?
I think anybody listening who relates in any way to this experience will have heard the old, oh, you make everything about you. It's
Mm.
not about you. That bloody well is about you. That is
Yeah,
about you. It's
yeah,
it's about being lied to about who your parent is. Absolutely, that's about you. And what it always interests me is this always comes out, this comment of you're making everything about you, or you're being really self-centered or selfish, or however they phrase it, where it's almost shameful and wrong to put
mm,
yourself at the center of something, even when you're at the center of something.
sure.
And what always baffles me is it's always in those moments where, of course, it's about you.
Yeah,
Of course, it's about you for that to be that topic, and you're allowed to take space. And it's another reminder of how you're taught that you shouldn't. You're
yeah.
taught that nothing is about you. You shouldn't be at the center of anything because it's all about them.
Yeah, yeah. And I think, naively, I think the young part of me believed that, if I found out the truth about this, then they would finally see her and what she's doing to me.
Mm,
They'll finally believe me. And it made me realize that there is nothing, no matter how big it is, that can make other people see something they're not ready to. And I think coming back to what you were saying before about, the connection between mothers and daughters and how that separation, being so hard, for me, I found it really difficult. It was really painful. I was trauma bonded to her, you know,
yeah.
and I think there's something really kind of visceral and an innate need to be connected to your mother.
Mm,
I wouldn't have done it otherwise unless it got to this point. But I think for her, it was really easy to let go of that.
mm. And that feels like such a big thing, doesn't it? In that there is this real need to be connected to your mother, in particular your mother, I think. And when they are so dismissive, it goes back to that hurt. And I think what you've just said there about none of them were ever going to realize, or none of them were ever going to acknowledge what
Mm,
she's like, because they might have those private realizations. But it takes so much to step outside of a toxic family dynamic,
yeah,
that actually, unless someone else is ready to do so, and I say this with clients all the time, you have to work out what is in the realm of your control and
yeah,
what's in the realm of your responsibility. And other people's reactions to you choosing to step away or to you setting boundaries is not in your control or your responsibility. And you can't change that. You
no,
can't change that your dad was the way that he was in receiving this information, as opposed to saying, I didn't know, or as opposed to saying, I did know and I protected this and this is why, I'm sorry.
mm,
You can't change that it made your sisters and yours relationship feel really awkward and uncomfortable.
mm,
And yet it's so difficult to make your peace with that. I think that is one of the most difficult parts, is
yeah,
when you can't get that support from the extended family. I did not really have much by way of extended family, to be honest.
right,
My mum had pretty much isolated us, and it was just me and
yeah,
her. She'd already managed to completely isolate my relationship with my dad, who was very neglectful anyway.
right,
And I think because of that, and because there were so few people around me, almost lessened that impact
mm.
of there's no one here to kind of be like almost invalidating again, that extra layer of I
No flying
don't
monkeys
believe
that are
you.
coming in.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And
Sure.
there were a few people that were friends of hers or like her sister who I wasn't close to. I think that was the difference. I wasn't close to these people. She might have tried to rebuild relationships on whatever level she could to send them as flying monkeys, but they
Mm,
didn't feel as impactful. And
mm,
it's so much more difficult, I think, when you have those close relationships where you just want someone to step forward for you and say, hey, yeah, this is
yeah.
awful behavior.
Yeah. And I think that felt like another betrayal in a way, in that,
Mm,
it always felt like me and my sister were allies in it, that we were in this dysfunction together and we've been there for each other for such a long time.
mm,
I'd reached the place that I'm at now because I've done a lot of therapy. My sister hasn't done that therapy. And for me, even after all of those years of therapy, to reach the point where I can let go of this, it was absolutely excruciating, to break that trauma bond. So, whilst it's hurtful to be in this position and to be the only one that, and no one can see it, I really get why she's still there, you know?
yeah. Yeah. And I think that's a massive thing, isn't it? Of being able to step outside of it and acknowledge it's so difficult to step away that we can understand why someone might not. That doesn't
Mm,
make it okay. And that doesn't mean that you're all right with them not choosing to step away when you really needed them to, but you can understand why. And I think that's a pretty big realization that often comes with having been through the therapy process. And talk to me a little bit more about trauma bonds, because it's something that I don't think we ever look at a maternal relationship as being a trauma bond. We often just think of it as, okay, you're always as a child going to need your mother. So
mm,
that's how we get into this situation. But it is a trauma bond when you have nothing but trauma between you. There is nothing there. There is no love, there is no affection, or if there is, it's done in a way to keep you, like you said, that one good day, you are
mm,
holding on to that, and it's that love bombing and then discard. And I
yeah.
think trauma bonding in particular is something that we don't really consider within these familial relationships.
Yeah. And I think there's something that can be almost like addictive in that process of there's an inconsistency, 90% of the time, my mum might sound disinterested or not know what to say in response to me or be unavailable. But then there'd be these glimmers that felt quite loving and she'd give me nice hugs and I'd feel connected to her and I guess it's a bit like the carrot dangling, that there's something that keeps you in the relationship because when it's nice, it feels really nice.
Mm,
And then, quickly you're devalued again. And you feel like the rug's been pulled from under your feet and you're heavily criticized for something really tiny and you're back trying to earn their love and approval again. But I think for me, what I realized actually was that it wasn't love that I was actually getting. And I realized that the good bits that I was getting were actually about meeting her needs. They weren't about meeting mine. I think the person that I loved was a fantasy version of who she is rather than actually who she is,
mm.
not her.
We do make those people in our heads, don't we? Of those versions of them, rather, in our heads of who
Yeah.
we need them to be growing up, because that's the only option, isn't it? If that's not your reality, there
Mm,
has to be some safe version in our head of, oh, well, if we just keep hanging on a bit longer, they might change this. Like you mentioned earlier, there was lots of drinking going on. I've heard time and time again, oh, well, eventually they'll stop drinking or oh, well, eventually this will get better and that's what we do. That's so normal. And I think there's a real kind of shame around that when we do manage to break out of that trauma bond of looking back. And I know I've done it to myself so many times of looking back and going, oh my God, why didn't you see it for what it was? Why didn't you step away from that? Why did you put yourself through that for so many years? I was in my 30s when I finally stepped away.
yeah,
And I definitely spent a long time beating myself up for not doing it sooner.
yeah. But I guess if we think compassionately and we look back, though, I see it as like a defense against abandonment because as children, we have no other choice but to keep hoping and believing that we must be the problem. Because if we're the
Mm,
problem and if we change, there's hope that things can be different. And if we don't, we are faced with a huge emotional, physical abandonment that actually our mum doesn't love us or isn't interested and a child can't survive abandonment. So they do the caretaking. They meet all of the needs that the parent should meet to hold some sense of a relationship. But actually, when I grew up and, as an adult, realized that I'm not a child anymore. I can survive without her. It feels like it's going to kill me to separate from her, but it won't.
I do think that feeling of it feels like it's going to kill me is so real. It's
Mm,
so real. It feels like it's going to be such a massive rift. And I think if there's anyone listening who is on the brink of that estrangement, who feels like they've just been pushed to a place where there's no other option and they don't know how they're ever going to facilitate a relationship because it's come to a point where it's just that bad that you
yeah,
just don't know if you've got it in you anymore to keep going. You will get through it. I think
yeah,
that's something that's so
absolutely.
important for people to realize is there is light on the other side of you will get through it. It's not easy and it's going to feel awful on some days. I think we could both agree on that sometimes you have those
Yeah,
big regrets and think, I wish that I could just have a mum hug. I wish that I could just have those nice moments. I wish that she could be the person that I wanted her to be. But
mm,
actually, she's not capable of that. And
no,
that's not my responsibility to make her capable of that by loving it into her. And I
yeah,
think that's something that we do is we try and be the daughter that she wants us to be. We try and be the person that's needed for our family dynamic or the role that we're slotted into and it's just not happening. And it's
no,
okay to let that go.
absolutely. And I think it's a daily reminder of your decision every day to grieve the grief, the young part of you that still holds on to the love and affection and the crumbs, but also to step in with an adult perspective of actually this is the reality and that she can't give you what you need, even if you went back for it. And you said something just then about choice as well, and it really reminded me that this is such a big thing in my story anyway, was the idea of choice. And I think that's what made it feel so isolating to be estranged, is that for other people, to if for others it might seem that I'd made a decision, and in some ways I had made a decision, I had made a choice, but it didn't feel like one at the time. It felt like the
Mm.
less of the worst options. It didn't feel like I had any other choice. It was the only way that I could stop this continual abuse cycle from happening. And I think I've experienced so many different types of grief, from bereavement and abandonment and all kinds of stuff. But I think to break the trauma bond with my mum was the hardest grief of all of
Mm.
them. And I think that can be such an isolating experience to have, particularly for other people. And if they are experiencing bereavement, because they just don't completely get where you're coming from. You've made this choice and I've lost this person and I didn't choose that. And in some ways, it would have been easier if they died. It would have
Oh,
been
yeah.
easier if they died years ago and I could have held on to that fantasy that I had about them being these perfect parents. And it's
Mm.
all gone. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, I couldn't relate to that more. I actually had a comment on one of my Instagram posts this afternoon saying
Right.
about choice and how
Mm,
people will look at you and say, well, why do you find this difficult? You made this choice. It was on things not to say to someone who is estranged. And
okay.
it's so interesting that you mentioned that because you're absolutely right. It does not feel like a choice. It feels, and nobody's stood there choosing to voluntarily orphan themselves.
No,
You
of
know, you
course.
are financially worse off, you are emotionally supportively worse off, you are worse off in so many ways
Yeah.
if you have that there, if you have that positive relationship. So you have to ask, why are all of those things not there in the first place when they're just basic things that a parent would do, even down to that financially different. It might not be that your parent gives you money because you're an adult, but you might be able to rely on them for child support, in terms of babysitting and that kind of thing. You might be able to rely on them for looking after your pets if you go away. That's one that we experience. There are
Mm,
so many different ways in which parents help their adult kids out.
yeah.
No one's choosing to ditch that if it's there. No one's choosing to let go of that parent adult child dynamic that can be so wonderful if it's a healthy one. So
Yeah.
it's never really a choice. And this comment had kind of said, people will make remarks to me about, well, you chose that when they're feeling down. And I
Yeah.
thought, yeah, you are so right. It's never just a choice, it's a corner that you feel backed into. And it
Mm,
feels like the only safe option That's
Yeah.
the difference.
Yeah. And I guess, for me with my structure as well, similar in that, everybody else had already been cut off. There wasn't anywhere else for me to go. I'd recently relocated to a new city, I had a few friends there. I didn't have any other family. I completely cut
Mm.
myself off. It wasn't like I had a better option and I could go somewhere else. And, I had my own family that I could focus on. I just completely threw myself out there on my own. And I
Mm.
think, again, that was another kind of grief in a way that, I would spend Christmas Day on my own and I would do it. And it didn't matter about the consequences because the truth was the important thing. And my morals about this not being okay anymore, I couldn't tolerate it anymore. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. It definitely does. And I think, can you talk to me a little bit about making that decision to step away from family whilst you are not part of your own chosen family unit? Because that, for me, I already had my kids. I did have my
Right.
spouse who could be supportive at times, but I had that kind of chosen family, if you like,
Mhm.
where I'd already built that little unit around me. I think it's really difficult for people who perhaps haven't built that unit. I know one of the things that I found difficult was having to talk to the kids about it, but it's
Yeah,
totally different complications for you, isn't it?
sure. I think probably, I had to make my own. I had to make my
Mm,
own chosen family, and that's through my friends. I'm really lucky that I do have some really good friends that get it and we're really supportive. And, they've become my family now. We've known each other for a really long time and they're wonderful.
yeah.
Um, but yeah, I think there were times when it was hard, like birthdays, Christmas days, like I say, when I was on my own. And I think, it's not to say that they didn't want me there. I have spent Christmas with friends since, but initially it was way too painful. I just couldn't do it.
Mm,
I just couldn't be around other people and be reminded of those dysfunctional dynamics of or seeing other people with family that I didn't have. It was too painful. I kind of just had to shut myself away for the day. But yeah, like I say, I'm in a much more different place than I was back then in that I can enjoy that and I can really appreciate the people that are around me and choose to be in my life because they do love me and they
mm,
do see the good in me. And that's a really different healing experience.
mm. I think that's so powerful, isn't it? In that your chosen family can look however you want it to. It can
Mm.
be whoever you want it to. The only requirement there really is that you treat each other with mutual respect and love. And
Yeah,
that's what matters. And that's what's so difficult when you can't get that from your family of origin.
yeah. And I think that's also where therapy steps in as well, to be honest. I think my therapist has been like family. We've known each other for a really long
Mm,
time, and he's been the paternal mother figure, all of the things that I've needed him to be. He's been there for me in that. And you're right. I think that it can show up in all different kinds of places.
absolutely. And just before we finish, is there anything that you would say to someone who is navigating a similar experience to you?
I think there might be something about trusting the process and trusting yourself.
Mm,
And I think it's that constant reminder of being able to be in the reality of your experience and to honor your experience. And I guess I just want to really acknowledge that it's an excruciating, painful experience sometimes. Even though it can be a hard choice, it doesn't necessarily mean it's the wrong one. And I guess there's something about giving yourself some grace about the process, about how you might manage that.
mm.
Like for me at first, I ended up going back because I thought that things could be different, and I learned that actually it couldn't. And I guess there's something about honoring your own process in that, about you will make decisions when you feel ready to make them.
Yeah, I really love that. And I think that there's no one way that this looks. There's no
No,
right way to navigate this
no,
experience because for so many of us, although we might all find that solidarity in that really made me feel that way, that really made me question my worth, that really made me feel gaslighted here, there might be things that we feel that sense of community in, but it
yeah,
is a very isolating experience and it is something that is really individual for everyone because
mm,
you might go back, you might not, you might feel a particular way about it, you might not. And however you are feeling about it is really okay.
yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I guess it's trying to separate as well and remembering those things that you might say about yourself, that
Mm.
actually that's the old stuff. That's the trauma talking. And you don't have to keep playing the role that they put you in. They can put you in this role, but you can choose to respond differently to it now.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, Harriet, thank you so much for
Oh, that's
coming on
okay.
and for talking so openly about your experience. Can you let people know where they can find you, please?
Yeah, so I'm on Instagram, the Good Enough Therapist with dots in between. Or you can find me on my website, which is harrietgleesontherapy.co.uk.
Amazing. That's great. And you mentioned that you do online therapy as well with both group sessions. And
Yeah.
did you say the sisterhood circle was it?
Yeah, I do both. So I have sisterhood circles as well, which helps people to heal their sister wound.
Oh, do you know, I love that. I think that's absolutely brilliant. I've never come across that before. Mother wound work, absolutely. But I think that would be really impactful for some people out there who are listening who have experienced that sister wound and who are looking to work through those
Mhm.
experiences and to heal that not good enough wound, like you said.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much for being a guest.
Thanks very much for having me. It's been lovely.
Right, guys, I will speak to you again next week. Take care. Bye.